undergoing treatment. And what this insider says she means when it's incurable, but the king is able to live with cancer. In her words, she says it means the king may die with cancer, but not of cancer, which might appear quite blunt, but it means the king is able to continue his duties as normal, like today in Lancaster.
Within seconds, the palace gates were swarmed. People are screaming, cameras flashing. The truth they'd been hiding for weeks was finally out. King Charles collapsed. The protection officer saw everything. And what happened in those final moments at Clarence House will haunt the royal family forever. But here's what they don't want you to know. The king's condition? Far worse than anyone imagined.
It will sadden us to know that the BBC's failures contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her. But what saddens me most is that if the BBC had properly investigated the complaints and concerns,
this changes everything. The evening of October 7th, 2025 began like any other Tuesday across the United Kingdom. Families sat down to dinner, commuters made their way home, and the news cycle hummed along with its usual rhythm. Then at precisely 6:47 p.m., every major broadcast network simultaneously cut to breaking news. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley, stood behind a podium bearing the official crest, his expression grave. What followed was a statement that would send shockwaves through not just Britain, but the entire world. "I stand before you this evening with a heavy heart," the commissioner began, his voice steady but somber. "It is my duty to confirm that we have serious and grave concerns regarding the health of His Majesty King Charles III. This information comes directly from the Royal Protection Command, and I can assure the public that appropriate measures are being taken." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Within seconds, social media platforms erupted. Hashtags began trending worldwide. News websites crashed under the sudden surge of traffic. Outside Buckingham Palace, confused tourists and concerned citizens began gathering, their phones held high, trying to capture whatever moment might come next. The unprecedented nature of this announcement cannot be overstated. Never in modern history has the Metropolitan Police publicly addressed the private health matters of a reigning monarch. The very fact that Sir Mark Rowley felt compelled to step forward suggested something far more serious than the usual palace health bulletins. Royal correspondents scrambled to make sense of what they were hearing. This was not coming from Buckingham Palace. This was not filtered through the careful language of royal communications directors. This was raw, official, and deeply alarming. As the commissioner continued his statement, he revealed details that made the situation even more troubling. Members of the Royal Protection Command observed changes in His Majesty's condition during the course of their duties. Following established protocols for the protection of high-ranking individuals, these observations were reported through proper channels. What I can tell you is that medical professionals have been involved, and the situation is being monitored closely. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The decision to make this public statement was not taken lightly. However, given the constitutional significance of the monarch's well-being, we felt transparency was essential. The questions came fast and furious from the assembled press corps. What exactly happened? When did this occur? Where is the king now? Is he in the hospital? What about the royal family? The commissioner held up his hand, his face betraying little emotion. "I cannot discuss specific medical details. What I can confirm is that an incident occurred at Clarence House within the last 48 hours that required immediate medical attention. His Majesty's personal protection officers were present and responded according to their training. Beyond that, I must respect both privacy and security protocols." But even these carefully measured words painted a disturbing picture. Protection officers are trained to handle threats, emergencies, and unexpected situations. For them to have escalated concerns about the king's health to the level where the commissioner himself felt obligated to address the nation suggested this was no minor health scare. Royal protection teams operate under strict guidelines about when and how to report concerns. The fact that this information had reached the highest levels of the Metropolitan Police indicated something had gone seriously wrong. Within the palace walls, chaos had reportedly been unfolding for hours before the public announcement. According to sources close to the royal household, the king's protection detail had noticed troubling signs during what should have been a routine evening. Charles had been scheduled for a private dinner with Queen Camilla at Clarence House. Staff members who were present described an atmosphere that shifted from normal to urgent within minutes. One moment, preparations were underway for a quiet meal. The next, royal protection officers were making urgent calls, and a private physician was being summoned with unusual haste. The speed at which events unfolded left little room for the usual palace machinery of communications management to spring into action. Royal aides who typically craft careful statements and manage public perception found themselves overtaken by events. The protection officers, bound by their legal obligations to report any situation that might constitute a threat to the life of a protected person, had already begun filing reports through Metropolitan Police channels. Once that process started, it became impossible for the palace to maintain its traditional control over the narrative. This created an extraordinary situation. The royal family has always maintained strict authority over announcements regarding the health and welfare of its members. From Queen Elizabeth's final days to Charles's own cancer diagnosis earlier in the year, information has flowed through official palace channels with careful timing and precise wording. But this time, the Metropolitan Police had effectively taken that control away. The protection officers, doing their duty as sworn police constables, had triggered a chain of events that palace officials could not stop. As news of the commissioner's statement spread, reactions poured in from around the world. The Prime Minister issued a brief statement expressing concern and offering full government support. Commonwealth nations released their own messages of worry and hope. But perhaps most significantly, members of the royal family themselves began responding. Prince William was reportedly in London when the news broke. Sources suggest he was immediately briefed by senior aides and palace officials, though the exact nature of those conversations remains private. What is known is that within an hour of the commissioner's statement, William was photographed arriving at Clarence House, his face set in a grim expression. Princess Anne, who had been attending an engagement in Scotland, abruptly cancelled her remaining schedule and made arrangements to return to London. Her reputation as the most steadfast and unshakable member of the royal family made her sudden change of plans all the more telling. When Anne drops everything to rush back to the capital, people notice. It signals that whatever is happening is serious enough to override even her famous sense of duty to public commitments. Most intriguingly, Prince Harry was seen boarding a commercial flight from Los Angeles to London within hours of the announcement. Passengers on the plane later reported that he appeared distressed and was accompanied by minimal security, suggesting the trip had been arranged hastily. The fact that Harry, who has been largely estranged from the royal family since his move to California, would drop everything and fly across the Atlantic spoke volumes about the gravity of the situation. Whatever differences exist between Harry and his father, this news had clearly cut through all of that. Back at Buckingham Palace, crowds continued to grow as darkness fell over London. People stood in silence, some holding candles, others simply waiting for any further news. The scene was reminiscent of the vigils held during Queen Elizabeth's final days, that same mixture of hope and dread hanging heavy in the autumn air. Television networks cleared their schedules, bringing in royal experts, medical professionals, and constitutional scholars to analyze what this might mean for the monarchy and the nation. The questions multiplied with each passing hour. How had the police learned about the king's condition before the public? What exactly had his protection officers witnessed that compelled them to break with centuries of royal privacy? Why had the commissioner himself chosen to make the announcement rather than letting palace officials handle it in their usual way? And perhaps most pressing of all, just how serious was the king's condition? To understand how the Metropolitan Police Commissioner came to stand before the world delivering such grave news, we must rewind 48 hours to a seemingly ordinary Sunday evening at Clarence House. The king's official London residence had settled into its usual weekend routine. Staff members moved quietly through corridors, preparing for what was scheduled to be a private dinner between Charles and Camilla. Outside, royal protection officers maintained their vigilant watch, rotating shifts with the precision that comes from years of training and experience. The protection detail assigned to the king that evening included some of the most experienced officers in the Royalty and Specialist Protection Command. These are not ordinary police officers. Each has undergone extensive vetting, years of specialized training, and countless hours learning to read situations and people with extraordinary accuracy. They are trained to spot threats, certainly, but also to notice subtle changes in behavior, unusual patterns, anything that might indicate a problem before it becomes a crisis. On this particular evening, that training would prove crucial. According to information that has emerged from multiple sources within the security services, the first signs of trouble came during what should have been a routine pre-dinner check. One of the senior protection officers noticed that the king appeared unusually fatigued as he moved through the residence. Charles has been known throughout his life as a man of tremendous energy, someone who maintains a schedule that would exhaust people half his age. Even during his ongoing cancer treatment, he has insisted on continuing with as many duties as possible. But this evening, something was noticeably different. The officer in question, whose name has not been publicly released for security reasons, quietly alerted his colleagues. Within the protection team, there are established protocols for this kind of situation. They observe, they document, and they communicate through secure channels. What they do not do is overreact or cause unnecessary alarm. But as the evening progressed, their concerns only deepened. The king's movements became slower, more labored. His usual sharp engagement with those around him seemed diminished. These were not dramatic changes, but to trained eyes, they were significant. When Charles and Camilla sat down for dinner, the protection officers maintained their positions as always, discreet but watchful. What happened next remains somewhat unclear, as the officers are bound by confidentiality protocols. However, what can be confirmed is that at some point during the meal, a situation developed that required immediate action. Staff members who were present have described hearing urgent voices, the sound of furniture moving quickly, and then the rapid arrival of additional security personnel. The king's personal physician, who maintains an on-call status at all times, was summoned immediately. This doctor, whose identity is protected for security reasons, arrived at Clarence House within 20 minutes. By then, Charles had been moved to a private room away from the dining area. Camilla remained with him, along with the most senior members of his protection detail and household staff. The atmosphere, according to those present, had shifted from casual to intensely focused in a matter of minutes. What the physician discovered during that examination set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the commissioner's public statement. Medical professionals who treat high-profile patients face a particular challenge. They must balance their duty to provide the best possible care with the complex protocols that surround royal privacy. But there are certain situations where medical judgment must take precedence over everything else. This, it appears, was one of those situations. Within the Metropolitan Police, there exists a specific framework for handling health emergencies involving protected persons. Royal protection officers are not simply bodyguards. They are sworn police constables with legal obligations that extend beyond their protective duties. When a situation arises that could constitute a threat to life, even if that threat comes from illness rather than external danger, they are required to report it through proper channels. This is not optional. This is the law. The senior protection officer on duty that evening faced an extraordinarily difficult decision. On one hand, centuries of tradition dictate that royal health matters remain private until the family chooses to share them. On the other hand, his training and his legal obligations as a police officer were clear. If the king's condition had deteriorated to a point where his life might be at risk, that information needed to move up the chain of command. After consulting with the physician and conferring with his immediate supervisor, he made the call to file an official report. That report landed on the desk of the head of Royalty and Specialist Protection Command by midnight. From there, it moved quickly through the Metropolitan Police hierarchy. By early Monday morning, senior officials were being briefed on the situation. The implications were immediately clear to everyone involved. This was not something that could simply be handled quietly within palace walls. The involvement of police officers in an official capacity meant that certain protocols had to be followed, regardless of what Buckingham Palace might prefer. Meanwhile, inside Clarence House, a very different kind of crisis was unfolding. Palace communications staff had been alerted to the medical situation, and they immediately began trying to manage what they saw as a potential public relations nightmare. The palace has sophisticated machinery for handling sensitive situations. They have protocols for every conceivable scenario, carefully crafted statements ready to deploy, and decades of experience in controlling narratives. But this situation was already slipping beyond their control. Queen Camilla found herself at the center of an impossible dilemma. As Charles's wife, her instinct was to protect him, to shield him from the additional stress that public scrutiny would bring. She had been aware for several weeks that his condition had been worsening despite the ongoing cancer treatment. There had been days when he struggled more than others, moments when the facade of royal strength became harder to maintain. She had consulted with his doctors, adjusted schedules, and done everything possible to give him space to recover away from public view. The idea that this private struggle might become public knowledge was deeply distressing to her. But Camilla's desire for privacy ran headlong into the realities of police procedure and legal obligation. The protection officers had already filed their reports. The Metropolitan Police leadership was now involved. And crucially, there were other members of the royal family who were beginning to ask questions. Princess Anne, always keenly attuned to undercurrents within the family, had heard whispers from staff members. These whispers suggested that something significant had happened at Clarence House, something beyond the usual management of the king's known health issues. Anne's response was characteristically direct. She contacted senior palace officials and demanded a full briefing on her brother's condition. What she learned during that conversation reportedly left her furious. According to sources close to the Princess Royal, she felt blindsided by the revelation that Charles's health had deteriorated so significantly without her knowledge. Anne has always seen herself as one of the steady pillars supporting the monarchy. To be kept in the dark about something this serious felt like both a personal betrayal and a failure of institutional trust. The confrontation that followed was described by those aware of it as intense and emotional. Anne insisted that the family needed to be transparent, both with each other and ultimately with the public. She argued that the days of hiding royal health problems behind palace walls were over, that the public deserved honesty, especially given Charles's position as head of state. Camilla, exhausted and protective of her husband, pushed back. She maintained that Charles deserved privacy during what was already an incredibly difficult time, that exposing his vulnerability would only make things harder. This disagreement represented a fundamental clash of philosophies about how the modern monarchy should function. Anne has long been an advocate for a more stripped-down, transparent royal family. Her own approach to royal duty has always emphasized getting on with the job without fuss or drama. Camilla, perhaps because of her own complicated journey into the royal family, has been more protective of boundaries between public and private life. Neither woman was entirely wrong, but their different perspectives made finding common ground nearly impossible. Prince William entered this fraught situation on Monday afternoon. As heir to the throne, he needed to be fully briefed on his father's condition and on the developing crisis with the Metropolitan Police. What he learned during meetings with palace officials and senior police representatives made clear just how complex the situation had become. The police were moving forward with their legal obligations. The palace could not stop them. The question was no longer whether information would become public, but how and when. William found himself in an unenviable position. His father was seriously ill. His stepmother was trying to protect his father's privacy. His aunt was demanding transparency and honesty. And hovering over all of it was the constitutional reality that the king's health is not merely a private family matter. It affects the entire nation and the Commonwealth beyond. As someone who has spent his entire life preparing for the responsibility of kingship, William understood the weight of this moment perhaps better than anyone. Across the Atlantic, Prince Harry received word of the situation through his own sources. The exact nature of these sources has not been confirmed, but Harry has maintained contacts within security services and among palace staff despite his estrangement from the family. When he learned that his father's health had taken a serious turn, his response was immediate. Whatever tensions exist between Harry and the rest of the royal family, the bond between father and son, however strained, had not been completely severed. By Tuesday morning, with Harry en route to London and pressure mounting from all sides, senior palace officials made a critical decision. They needed to coordinate with the Metropolitan Police rather than fight against them. Attempting to suppress information that was already moving through official channels would only make things worse when the truth inevitably emerged. Better to try to shape the message than to lose control of it entirely. This is when discussions began about how a public announcement might be made. The palace wanted to issue its own statement, carefully worded and released on their timeline. The Metropolitan Police, however, had already determined that the commissioner needed to address the situation directly. The compromise that emerged was an understanding that Sir Mark Rowley would make his statement, focusing on the police involvement and the procedural aspects, while leaving medical details to be addressed by the palace at a later time. As these negotiations unfolded behind closed doors, the clock was ticking toward that evening's unprecedented press conference. The machinery of state was moving forward, carrying everyone along with it, whether they were ready or not. The decision for Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley to speak publicly represented a seismic shift in how royal health matters would be handled in the 21st century. By Tuesday afternoon, all the key players had reluctantly accepted that there was no path forward that did not involve public disclosure. The only question remaining was how to frame the information in a way that served both transparency and the dignity of the monarchy itself. Senior palace officials, police leadership, and government representatives huddled in emergency meetings throughout the day, trying to craft an approach that would satisfy legal obligations while minimizing panic. The decision to hold the press conference at Scotland Yard rather than Buckingham Palace was itself significant. It underscored that this announcement was coming from law enforcement authorities acting in their official capacity, not from the royal household managing its public image. When Sir Mark Rowley stepped to that podium at 6:47 p.m., he was not speaking as someone deferring to royal preferences. He was speaking as the head of Britain's largest police force, fulfilling what he saw as a duty to the public he serves. The immediate aftermath of his statement was unlike anything royal correspondents had witnessed in their careers. Within minutes, every major news organization in the world had broken into regular programming. The BBC cleared its entire evening schedule. American networks interrupted primetime broadcasts. In countries across the Commonwealth, from Canada to Australia to New Zealand, the news dominated headlines. This was not just another royal health update. This was a constitutional moment, the kind that comes perhaps once in a generation. Social media platforms struggled to keep pace with the volume of reaction. Twitter saw the hashtag #King Charles trending worldwide within 5 minutes of the announcement. Facebook and Instagram are filled with expressions of concern, shock, and confusion. The global nature of the response reflected both the residual affection many people still hold for the British royal family and the universal human concern when someone in the public eye faces a serious health crisis. Outside Buckingham Palace, the crowd that had begun gathering during the press conference swelled to several thousand people by nightfall. Police erected barriers to manage the flow of humanity converging on the royal residence. Some people brought flowers, even though the king was not actually at Buckingham Palace. Others held candles as darkness fell over London. There was an impromptu quality to the gathering, a sense that people simply needed to be together in this moment of uncertainty. Prince William's response, when it came, struck exactly the right tone for the moment. Shortly after 9 p.m., Kensington Palace released a statement in his name. The carefully chosen words acknowledged the public's concern while providing just enough information to calm the most extreme fears. "My father is receiving the best possible medical care," the statement read. "Our family is grateful for the skill and dedication of his medical team and for the protection officers who acted with such professionalism. We ask for privacy during this challenging time, But we also recognize the public's deep affection for His Majesty and their right to know about matters that affect our nation. Behind the scenes at Clarence House, King Charles himself was facing the reality of his situation with a complicated mixture of frustration and resignation. According to sources close to the king, he was deeply unhappy about the public nature of what he had hoped to manage privately. Charles has always been a deeply private person, despite living his entire life in the public eye. The idea that the details of his health crisis were now being discussed on television and social media around the world was profoundly uncomfortable for him. Yet there was also a grudging acceptance that perhaps this forced transparency was not entirely a bad thing. Charles had already spoken publicly about his cancer diagnosis earlier in the year, hoping that his openness might encourage others to seek medical help. Now, even in this more acute crisis, there might be value in showing that even kings are vulnerable, that health struggles can affect anyone regardless of position or privilege. Prince Harry's arrival in London the following morning created its own media frenzy. Photographers captured him looking exhausted and drawn as he was driven directly from Heathrow Airport to Clarence House. The symbolic power of Harry's presence was enormous. Here was a son who had publicly criticized the royal institution, who had moved thousands of miles away to escape its constraints, dropping everything and flying across the ocean because his father needed him. Whatever bitterness existed between Harry and other family members, whatever hurt and anger had built up over the years, this moment cut through all of it. The reunion between Charles, William, and Harry was the first time the three had been together in the same room for over a year. Staff members who were present described an atmosphere that began awkwardly, weighted down by all the unspoken tension and unresolved conflict. But as they talked, as Charles's vulnerability became impossible to ignore, something shifted. The protective walls that had been built up began tentatively to come down. This was not a complete healing of all wounds, but it was a beginning, forced by circumstances yet undeniably real. Princess Anne's role during these critical days cemented her position as the steady hand the family desperately needed. While emotions ran high and old conflicts threatened to resurface, Anne maintained her characteristic focus on what needed to be done. She coordinated with palace officials, liaised with medical staff, and kept the broader family informed. Her years of experience as the hardest-working royal made her uniquely suited to navigate this crisis. By Wednesday afternoon, Buckingham Palace released a more detailed medical update. The statement acknowledged that the king had experienced a significant health episode related to his ongoing cancer treatment. It confirmed that he was receiving intensive medical care, but was stable and responding well to treatment. Crucially, it also announced that Charles would be stepping back from public duties for a period of weeks to focus entirely on his recovery. The constitutional machinery shifted smoothly into established protocols. Counselors of state, including Prince William and Princess Anne, would handle the king's official duties during his recovery. Government business would continue without interruption. The system that had been built over centuries to ensure continuity, even when the monarch was incapacitated, proved its worth once again. In the days that followed, something unexpected emerged from the crisis. Public support for the royal family showed a marked uptick. People appreciated the honesty, the vulnerability, the very human struggle playing out before them. The image of his sons putting aside their differences to support their father touched something deep in the public consciousness. Perhaps this forced moment of transparency had actually strengthened, rather than weakened the monarchy's connection to the people it served.